Marcus Kane didn't believe in second chances. He believed in spreadsheets, quarterly numbers, and the idea that people who ended up on the street had made choices that put them there. At 46, he ran Kane Logistics, a trucking and warehouse empire worth $1,100 million, out of a glass office on the 41st floor of a tower on Michigan Avenue. From up there, the people on the sidewalk looked like ants. He liked it that way. It was a Tuesday morning in October when his COO, a sharp-tongued woman named Priya Deshpande, walked into his office holding a tablet like it was a weapon. "You said something at the shareholder dinner last night that half the room is still talking about." "I say a lot of things." "You said homeless people are homeless because they refuse to work." Priya set the tablet on his desk. "One of the board members wants to know if you'd stand behind that on camera." Marcus leaned back in his leather chair. "I'll do better than that. I'll prove it." That afternoon, he had his assistant post a single flyer outside the downtown shelter on Wabash Avenue. 1 day of work, $200 cash, warehouse floor, no questions asked. He wanted footage of a homeless person failing to show up, failing to finish, failing to matter. Proof for his theory. Proof his father had been right when he said the world didn't owe anybody a soft landing. At 6 the next morning, standing in the gray light outside his own warehouse, in a coat that cost more than most people's rent, Marcus watched a line of 9 people form near the loading gate. Some shifted their weight against the cold. Some carried the entire contents of their lives in duffel bags, because leaving them anywhere unattended meant losing them. He'd expected desperation. He hadn't expected the quiet, businesslike way most of them checked in names, ID numbers, eyes forward like people who had done far harder mornings than this one. Near the back of the line, a woman walked toward the gate, carrying a sleeping toddler on her hip and a backpack slung over one shoulder. A second child, a girl of about 7, gripping the hem of her coat. Her name, according to the clipboard, was Renata Vaughn, 31 years old, 2 kids, no fixed address. He almost sent her away right there. He hadn't expected anyone to bring children to a warehouse floor, and for a moment the whole exercise felt like it was slipping out of his control, turning into something messier and more human than the tidy failure he'd come to film. Marcus's father, Elias Kane, had built the first Kane trucking route with a single flatbed and a bank loan he almost didn't pay back. He was a hard man from a hard decade, and he raised his son on one repeated phrase: "Nobody carried me. I carried myself." When Marcus was 12, his father drove him past a line outside a soup kitchen in Gary, Indiana, and pointed out the window without slowing the truck. "Every one of those people had a chance," Elias said. "Somewhere along the way, they stopped trying. Don't you ever let me see you standing in a line like that?" Marcus never forgot the shame in his father's voice. Like standing in that line was a moral failure instead of a circumstance. He carried that lesson into boardrooms for 20 years. He built Kane Logistics on efficiency and distance warehouses, run by managers he never met, drivers he only knew as route numbers, a company of 12,000 employees whose faces he couldn't have picked out of a lineup. He told himself compassion was inefficient. He told himself the market rewarded people who worked hard and punished people who didn't, and that this was simply how the world was supposed to function. It was easier to believe that than to ask what his empire actually cost the people at the bottom of it. There had been a moment, years earlier, when a warehouse manager in Toledo had asked Marcus for funding to install a small daycare room for employees who couldn't afford childcare on a loading dock wage. Marcus had denied the request in 4 sentences over email, citing non-core operational expense, and never thought about it again until this morning, watching a woman rock a sleeping toddler while she waited to be judged for a job that paid $200. Standing in the warehouse loading dock that morning, watching Renata gently hand her sleeping son to an older woman waiting nearby, a shelter volunteer who'd agreed to watch him for the day, Marcus felt something shift he didn't have a name for yet. Renata Vaughn had been a supply chain coordinator for 6 years before her company folded during a merger. Severance ran out in 4 months. Her husband had left before their second child was born. By the time she walked through the shelter doors on Wabash Avenue, She'd already sold her car, her furniture, and most of her pride. She didn't know the man in the gray coat handing out clipboards was the owner of the company. To her, he was just another site manager, and she needed the $200 more than she needed to ask questions. The floor manager, a heavy-set man named Dwayne, who'd worked for Kane Logistics for 15 years, put her on inventory reconciliation matching shipment manifests against actual pallet counts, a job that had stumped 2 of his regular staff for a week. Marcus watched from the mezzanine, arms crossed, waiting for her to fall behind, waiting for the excuse he'd flown down to collect. Bitten mais? Renata had found a discrepancy in the manifest system that Dwayne hadn't caught in 3 months, a batch of mislabeled SKUs, costing the company roughly $4,000 a week in phantom inventory. She didn't announce it. She just fixed the tracking sheet and kept working. "She's fast," Dwayne said, standing next to Marcus. "Faster than half the guys I got on payroll." Marcus said nothing. He was recalculating something in his head that had nothing to do with inventory. By 9:30, Renata had reorganized the reconciliation sheet into a format that let 2 other trial workers catch up on pallets they'd been stuck on for an hour. She didn't do it to be noticed. She did it because leaving 3 people stalled behind a bad spreadsheet made the whole shift slower. And slower shifts meant somebody's $200 might not clear before the shelter's evening curfew. Marcus watched her explain the fix to a nervous 19-year-old named Tyrell in the kind of patient, unhurried voice he'd never once used with an employee himself. At noon, Renata sat alone in the break room, eating a sandwich she'd packed that morning, the last of the bread from a food pantry box. Marcus walked in under the cover story he'd given the staff, a corporate consultant doing a floor audit. He sat 2 tables away and pretended to review paperwork while he watched her. She didn't complain. She didn't perform gratitude either, the way some people did around anyone who looked like money. She simply ate her sandwich, checked the time, and went back to work 4 minutes before her break officially ended. He asked her, carefully, how she'd learned to read a manifest system that fast. "I used to run a warehouse floor in Ohio," she said. "Company folded. I've applied to 60-something jobs since March. Nobody wants to hire someone with a 6-month gap and no permanent address to put on the form." She said it flatly, without asking for sympathy, the way people say things they've made peace with out of necessity rather than acceptance. Marcus thought about the flyer he'd posted. No questions asked. He'd meant it as a trap, a way to catch someone failing on camera. Instead, by noon, the only person failing anything was him, and the failure wasn't hers to carry. He thought about his father's voice in the truck outside that soup kitchen in Gary. Every one of those people had a chance. He wondered, for the first time in 34 years, whether his father had ever actually asked one of them what their chances had looked like. At 2:47 in the afternoon, a forklift battery in Bay 6 began smoking. Within 90 seconds, the smell of melting plastic had spread across the floor, and a small electrical fire caught the edge of a wooden pallet stacked with imported textiles. The fire suppression system in that bay had been flagged for maintenance 3 weeks earlier and never repaired, a cost-cutting decision buried somewhere in a budget report Marcus had approved without reading closely. Workers scattered. Dwayne shouted for the extinguisher, but the nearest one was mounted behind a locked cabinet whose key nobody could find fast enough. Renata didn't run. She grabbed a fire blanket from the nearest safety station, threw it over the burning pallet, and started dragging the 2 nearest stacks of inventory away from the flame path before anyone else had finished processing what was happening. She'd done exactly this before, she said later. A smaller fire, a different warehouse, a different life. She knew what 30 seconds of hesitation cost. By the time the sprinkler override finally kicked in, the fire was contained to a single pallet instead of an entire bay. No one was hurt. The loss was in the thousands instead of the millions. Afterward, the fire marshal, who arrived to inspect the scene, asked who had made the call to isolate the flame, instead of waiting for the extinguisher cabinet to be unlocked. Dwayne pointed at Renata. The marshal, a stocky man named Ortiz who'd seen 100 warehouse fires in his career, told her flatly that her instincts had likely kept this one out of the news. She just nodded, and asked if she could go check on her son, who'd watched the whole thing from behind the safety glass of the break room, his crayon still in his hand. Marcus stood at the edge of the chaos, coat forgotten on a chair somewhere behind him, watching a woman he'd hired to fail save his warehouse and possibly several of his employees while wearing a borrowed high-vis vest 2 sizes too big. That evening, after the smoke cleared and the fire marshal had come and gone, Marcus found Renata sitting on the loading dock steps, waiting for her shift-end pay like everyone else, her son now awake and drawing on a piece of cardboard beside her. He sat down next to her, still in his undershirt, forearms streaked with soot from helping move stock during the fire, something none of his employees had ever seen him do, because he'd never done it. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I own this company." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression didn't shift the way he expected. No performance, no sudden flattery, just tired, level eyes. "Okay," she said. "Does that change my $200? "No," he said. "It changes a lot more than that." He told her about the flyer, the shareholder dinner, the theory he'd wanted to prove wrong about her before she'd even walked through the gate. He didn't dress it up. He'd built a test designed to confirm what he already believed, and she had spent 8 hours dismantling it without knowing that was what she was doing. "I'm not offering you $200, he said. "I'm offering you the floor supervisor position Dwayne's been asking me to fill for 6 months. Full benefits, company housing assistance until you're stable. Starting tomorrow if you want it." Renata studied him the way she'd studied every stranger who'd ever offered her something too good in the last 6 months, carefully, for the catch. She didn't find one. Marcus Kane didn't fly back to the Michigan Avenue Tower that night. He drove Renata and her children to the shelter himself, in his own car, and sat in the parking lot afterward for a long time before he called his father's old business partner, the only person left alive who remembered the man from the truck in Gary, Indiana. "I think Dad had it backwards," Marcus said when the man finally picked up. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. 3 weeks later, Kane Logistics quietly rolled out a pilot program at 4 of its warehouses. Paid trial days for applicants without permanent addresses, no employment gap penalties, and an on-site partnership with 2 local shelters for childcare during shifts. Douane Rond-Point Oni. Renata, 6 weeks into her new position, helped design the training schedule, because nobody understood better than she did what the gap in the system actually looked like from the inside of it. Marcus never told the board the real reason for the policy change. He didn't need their approval, and he didn't want their applause. He'd built his whole life avoiding the people his decisions affected. It had taken 1 woman, 1 fire, and 1 very long shift for him to understand that the distance he'd mistaken for discipline had only ever been a wall, and that respect, real respect, wasn't something you could hand someone in an envelope of cash. By sunset, she hadn't just kept a warehouse from burning down. She'd earned something Marcus Kane had never given away for free in his entire career. Months later, when reporters finally caught wind of the pilot program and asked Marcus what had inspired it, he gave them a short answer that left out almost everything that mattered. He didn't mention the flyer, or the bet, or the fire, or the sound his father's voice used to make outside that soup kitchen in Gary. He just said a good employee had shown him something he should have already known. Renata never asked him to tell the whole story. She didn't need the credit. She had a title now, a lease with her name on it, and a son who no longer asked if they were camping. That was enough. Some debts, she'd learned, don't get repaid with an apology. They get repaid with what you build next.